Language Loss as Loss of Place by Jennifer Rose. I'd like to explore with you today what language loss means for the places they are shaped by. When given the proposition to explore extinction, language was the first thing that came to mind for me. This is because through my studies so far I've been confronted with the limitations of the English language to express concepts which are understood by many indigenous cultures. I've been questioning the extent to which my own worldview has been shaped by the language I speak and how this has affected my own relationship to place. So in today's presentation, I'd like to take you through some preliminary research and reflections I've been doing on how language affects our relationship to place. I'll start with some facts and figures regarding the current state of world languages, and then I'll explore how we've come to the situation that languages are being rapidly lost. I aim to explore how culture and language are intertwined and reflective of one another, and consequently what language loss means for the people who once spoke them. Finally, I'll explore in more depth what this means for the places that these languages were once spoken, and how this affects the human and non-human world at large. So here are some facts and figures from UNESCO around languages in the world. So 97% of the world speak only 4% of the world's languages, and 96% of the world's languages are spoken by only 6% of the world's people. The best estimate is that 50% of the world's languages are in decline, but the worst estimate is that around 90% are in decline. So this graph shows the language loss according to continent. So why do we lose languages? There are many possible reasons and influencing factors as to why languages are pushed to extinction. The main force at play here is colonization. This puts pressures on languages both externally through military, religious or economic pressure, and also internally through the loss of interest in preserving an oppressed language by younger generations. People are forced to abandon language as a means of survival. Adopting the language of the colonizer enables assimilation, employment, and some social mobility. During the colonization of many lands, the colonial forces suppressed indigenous language use through marginalization. For example, in North America, the governments placed indigenous children into residential schools where they were systematically forced to adopt colonial culture and language, and where they were violently abused for speaking indigenous languages. As a result, these people went on to lose the language which they were born into, and the language fell into rapid decline. Here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the European colonizers initially learned some Maori as a means of conducting trade and learning about the land. However, as the European population of Aotearoa grew, Maori was pushed towards near extinction through active, often violent oppression. After the Second World War, many Maori people were forced to move to urban settings in order to work, and the language of urban Aotearoa, New Zealand was English, and the imperative was to adopt English in order to survive economically in colonial society. Recently, the last man in the Amazon to speak Tausharoa made global news which brought the reality of language loss to a global stage. Amadeo Garcia Garcia has nobody left to speak in his native tongue with, and sadly, when he dies, so too will Tausharoa. There are many other examples of a language such as this one on the brink of extinction, as the older generations are the only ones left to speak it. Younger people have little incentive to learn a dying language when the dominant language is the one that they need to be able to prosper. So what's it like to speak a language on the edge of extinction? Amadeo Garcia Garcia is a very sad man. In a New York Times video about him, he strikes a lonely figure. With no one to converse with, he has no way to express himself in the language he grew up with, and he understands the world through He is under pressure from outsiders to try to preserve Taoshiro, but marginalisation has taken a toll, and he's reliant on alcohol to manage day-to-day life. Much to the dismay of linguists looking to preserve a language before it dies out, Garcia is not interested in being the sole source of information for this project, and he's understandably seemed to have lost hope. It's a precarious position to be one of the last speakers of a language. It's a sad and lonely situation for many of the elders around the world who are speaking a dying language. And it's not in the scope of this presentation to investigate the myriad ways in which language influences identity and the resultant challenges to mental well-being that colonialism and language loss have on Indigenous people throughout the world. Language and culture are inextricably linked. One is shaped by and reflects the other. We use our language to express that which is deemed important in our doings in the world. In turn, the language we use enables our perception and interpretation of the world around us. We see differences in cognitive abilities between cultures based on the way that language is used, which demonstrates to us how important our language is for understanding the world around us. So with all this in mind, what is the influence of language on place, and therefore what happens to place when the language is lost? Clearly, when we lose language, we also lose culture. Different people come with different histories, experience and understanding of the world. And when people interact with place, they bring this to the relationship. But land too has agency, and this is a concept shared by many Indigenous cultures. Land comes with its own temporal and cultural experiences. Whatever has gone before, whether geological, cosmological, architectural, human or non-human, fact or folklore, it's brought to the interaction of human and place. So I suggest that when we lose the language of the land, we lose appreciation of the agency of that place. We lose the folklore, the oral histories, and the complex human and non-human interactions with that place. I believe that we lose something essential to place. Place is no longer the same because the interaction of the human and non-human is fundamentally changed. What we're left with is space, and this is exactly how land has been treated by colonizers the world over. Land that was viewed by Indigenous people as a gift, something that could never be owned, was stolen and separated into private property for European settlers. It was seen as capitalist commodity, space just going to waste. As Indigenous communities were repeatedly and systematically removed from land, so too was their intricate and culturally transmitted knowledge of that place. Many languages have important ecological information encoded in place names. For example, the Seri people of Mexico refer to a shoal in the ocean called Musni Udvija. Apologies again for the pronunciation, which translates to what the green sea turtles encircle. This is important information for fishing. And this sort of information is important for survival and allows us to both understand the biodiversity of place as well as that which may have been lost from that place. Many Indigenous cultures use language which personifies place. For example, the citizen Potawatomi Nation of the Great Plains use verbs to describe land instead of nouns. So a hill is to be a hill, ascribing that place with an aliveness that English cannot express. In English, if something cannot be described with humanness as he or she, it's relegated to being it, an inanimate object devoid of animacy. In Liam Campbell's essay, Exile, Belonging and Post-Colonialism in an Irish River Catchment, he speaks about the stories of nature that are embedded in local language and how, when a dominant language takes over, so too does the cultural framework. As biodiversity starts to disappear, it's the local people who notice first. A local farmer tells him, "We had so many names for watery places. but the names are gone now and nobody knows the places anymore. Traditional livelihoods are also threatened by both language loss and land loss. The oral traditions that sustained many of these traditional livelihoods often pass down information about conservation and sustainability necessary for maintaining a livelihood for both the current dwellers and the future generations. As the land was lost, so too the livelihoods and the knowledge were lost too, and the knowledge of how to sustainably use the Earth's resources was ignored, overlooked, and actively suppressed by colonial forces. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, Maori people are Tangata Whenua, people born of the land. The land is viewed as part of the whakapapa, the genealogy of the people. Tangata Whenua have mana whenua, referring to a customary authority held over land by a tribe. This mana whenua is derived from the land, not bestowed on them. Land must be looked after in the way an elderly relative would be cared for. Maori is classed as a vulnerable language, and many people with Maori whakapapa have lost links to their culture and the deep ecological appreciation of land along with their language as a result of colonialism. The consequence for land is that the dominant discourse for so long has been the capitalist language of ownership and resource. For those people who feel that as Tangata Whenua, the land is family, the exploitation of resources by colonizers is akin to seeing a family member inflicted with pain. I believe that the limitations of the English language to be able to acknowledge the agency of land in everyday discourse has contributed to the capitalist and colonial attitudes that have led us into the Anthropocene and away from interconnectedness inherent in many indigenous cultures. The result of all this is that biodiversity loss is happening at an alarming rate, which mirrors the rate of language loss throughout the world. It leads me to question, what non-human languages are also being lost? Language preservation matters to all of us. It shows us the capacities that we have as humans. Biodiversity is supported by language preservation and is linked to healthy ecosystems which can sustain life of humans and non-humans alike. Language diversity allows for diversity of thought and divergent thinking to enable problem solving, which is especially important in our current time of climate crisis. Shared humanity and the multiplicity of entanglements of human and non-human is better understood through language diversity. There are many efforts happening around the globe to reconnect to these indigenous ways of knowing, to amplify the conservation movement aimed at fighting the effects of biodiversity loss. Some scholars and scientists are linking Western science with indigenous science to create a more in-depth understanding of biodiversity. With this, language revival is as important as biodiversity conservation. With understanding of indigenous taxonomies, scientists are able to access a wealth of knowledge which can be combined with Western scientific know-how to improve conservation efforts. There are also many indigenous-led conservation initiatives which are seeing success, and the critical role of which has been highlighted by the WIS Campaign for Nature report on the success of indigenous-led projects. For example, the Nature Conservancy and Ngari Ngari people of New South Wales, Australia, have successfully established an over 200,000 acre sustainable agriculture zone, representing both a breakthrough for conservation and a significant return of land to rightful guardianship. Governments have established language strategies to ensure the survival of declining languages, such as here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where Maori speakers have been slowly growing in numbers. Efforts are being made to revive languages that are on the decline through the use of social media hashtagging and initiatives like this comic book from Mexico, which is printed in Hanjo, English and Spanish. In 2008, the UN established a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which ensures the right to self-governance, intellectual property, prior informed consent, and maintenance of language and culture while seeking sustainable economic development. These efforts give hope to slowing the rate of language decline, whilst also slowing the rate of biodiversity loss and supporting the agency of place. Much of the work being done centres around conservation, which is a good start. However, for meaningful long-term change, a shift in perspective is needed, and there's much to be learned through Indigenous knowledge if the dominant culture can make space and listen. Perhaps if we challenge ourselves to view the world through a marginalised language, we can start to restore agency to the places that have shaped them. So, I'd like to leave you with a couple of questions. How has your language shaped your understanding of the world and your place in it? And as speakers of a dominant language, how can we support the preservation of Indigenous language and culture? So at the bottom here, you'll find my references if you're interested in further reading. Right now, I'm tucked up in bed on the other side of the world, and I'll be catching up with a Q&A session tomorrow. I'm keen to hear your thoughts and experiences on this subject. It's a huge subject, and I've only really been able to touch very lightly on it. So, I'd like to leave you with a couple of questions. How has your language shaped your understanding of the world and your place in it? And as speakers of a dominant language, how can we support the preservation of Indigenous language and culture? So below you'll find my references if you're interested in further reading. Right now I'm tucked up in bed on the other side of the world, so I'm going to be catching up with the Q&A session at a later date. But I'm really keen to hear your thoughts and experiences on this subject. I've only really been able to touch very lightly at the surface of this huge topic. Thanks for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks for getting that going, Matt.
That's okay.
And thanks to Jennifer when you do listen in for a really interesting, provoking presentation. Yeah, it's good to be reminded too that language extinctions, language diversity are a very important part of the dialogues that we're having today. That reminded me of an artwork I saw by Susan Hiller on dying and dead languages.
Yeah.
And I expect other people have other thoughts to contribute in response to that. Any hands? Things you want to say?
Well, as I seem to have taken over the chat for them for a moment, sorry about that, folks. I may as well say some of the things that I've been writing, but first of all, I really enjoyed the link between making a clear link between the loss of biodiversity and loss of language, which you think about it seems self-evident. But I was also thinking about our own back door here in the UK, where, you know, the Celtic language that was thrown out by the colonizers more than 10,000 years ago. Is that right? No, 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years ago, sorry. Has slowly, has in some places kept its validity, so that in Irish, for example, Irish Gaelic is still taught in schools and is still very much a living language. Whereas at the opposite end of the scale, you know, Cornish Gaelic is basically only kept alive by a small group of specialists, but you can't really in any sense describe it as a living language. I should be very careful what I say, not being that far from Cornwall, but there's sheer extremes there of a language that in one country left behind has survived and in another country subsumed by the colonizers entirely has pretty much disappeared.
Thanks, Richard. There's a few hands up here. Theo, would you like to make a comment?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciated the first of those two questions that Jennifer put to us at the end. I think it really helps us to consider our position as people of the global north or colonized places elsewhere. English has become a worldwide language, but as individuals, I think it helps us to address our position as colonials, colonists. How do we describe it? People who colonized, the colonizers. That's right. Because I think as we look at that in ourselves, we can address the racism that we have inevitably built into our experience of ourselves and of the world. And I do think we should try and address that question as individuals and as a community, really. The learning, speaking of English from the beginning of our lives, this may not apply to everybody that I'm speaking to at the moment, but it does apply to me. English is how I experience the world. And though I have learnt other European and non-European languages to some extent, as an English speaker, I've thought, oh, that's a difficult thing to do. I think English speakers do think it's a difficult thing to do, to learn another language and to use another language. We've become quite arrogant, really, with our language and don't necessarily recognize ourselves as people who are kind of taking over the world. We're part of that through our language. I think that's enough.
Thanks. Yes. Judith Kate. Judith Kate.
Yeah.
Are you able to join us? We saw you briefly, but we can't hear you.
No, back.
You're muted.
Sorry, I was trying to be slick here and said go to Matt, but of course you didn't hear me because I was muted. Oh dear. Okay, this is oh, it's already 6 a.m. here. Anyway, it's been a little bit of a flip-flop for me on the west coast of the U.S. I will be speaking about some of this in my presentation at the end today, regarding my own heritage and the Yiddish language, and the idea of assimilation really comes strong to me. So it's not only the phenomenon of the colonization from without or from the people that did the colonizing, but it's also to what degree do we each, and did we each or our ancestors have to assimilate to whatever the dominant thing was that came. And so it's just, building on the thread of everything that was already said. And it's something I'm clearly passionate about and want to keep learning more about. Really appreciated the presentation.
Thanks. Matt.
Yeah, thanks. I did too. Really, really, really great to hear that conversation open here. And I, like Richard, I found myself coming back to this aisle, actually, and to the sort of languages here. And I was recently shown a piece of wood that was put around the neck of a school child in a Welsh school if they were caught speaking Welsh. From memory, and you would want to fact check this, it was as late as the 1960s that shaming device was being used. So a really interesting case in point how the Welsh language was and has been really successfully recovered as a sort of political act and a cultural political act of Wales. But in Cornwall, I was thinking even more specifically, I think Richard's right in that Cornwall as a kind of, that Cornish is not a living language, I think, although there are people that speak it, but a case in point of a friend seeking to answer those two really good questions. How has your language shaped your understanding of the world and your place in it? as speakers of a dominant language, how can we support the preservation of Indigenous language and culture? I was thinking about a friend, a poet called Katrina Naomi. She hails from Margate. She's made West Cornwall her home in Penzance. One of the acts that she's undertaken a long-term commitment to is learning Cornish as someone who's made her home in Cornwall. And I don't know if it straightforwardly addresses a discourse of colonisation, but it is to do with the agency of land, I think, and the place, and a kind of devotion to being in Cornwall. So she's not pretending to be from Cornwall, but she is bothering to learn the language as somebody whose work is about language. Maybe I would be really interested to hear a conversation between her and Jennifer.